Things have got seriously ugly. There's a moment that tells you everything that you need to know about the state of modern gaming, and it's not even about a game that's even out yet. Just days ago, Sony finally unveiled the first full trailer for Marvel's Wolverine, a project that should have had players debating combat mechanics, story direction, or how Insomniac intends to bring one of Marvel's most popular characters to life. But instead, within minutes of the footage dropping, the conversation wasn't about gameplay at all, but instead about Mystique's face. That's right. Before anyone could analyse the plot or discuss gameplay systems, social media was already flooded with screenshots and side-by-side comparisons, with commenters pointing out how radically different they thought Mystique's appearance looked from earlier interpretations. Some viewers have described her as looking masculinised, off-model, and, in the words of Cosmic Book News, emblematic of a familiar AAA trend of making iconic female characters look less conventionally attractive. On Reddit, the reaction was even more blunt. One user asked, "Are we certain that's not a man?" Another quipped, "Is that Megamind wearing a wig?" And dozens more echoed the same sentiment, that they believe that one of Marvel's most alluring femme fatales has been remodelled into something that barely resembles her. And when it comes to this game, it wasn't just Mystique. Leaked images of Jean Grey from the same title have drawn similar criticism, with fans comparing her to a man dressed as a poorly disguised woman and, less politely, a bridge troll. These designs slot neatly into a wider trend, one that many argue marks not just the deliberate downgrading of female characters in Western gaming, but a broader aesthetic decline across Western media as a whole. But are things really as ugly as they look on the surface, or is there something deeper at play here? I am Lady Decade, and if you've got good taste and at least 3 functioning brain cells, then please hit that subscribe button, and if you enjoy this video, then perhaps give it a little hype for me as well. Thank you. Anyway, now we're about to discuss what the bloody hell is going on here. If there is one thing better than beautiful games packed with equally beautiful characters, it's getting beautiful games packed with beautiful characters for next to nothing. Use my links to receive up to 90% off of thousands of stunning games, including massive money off of Expedition 33, Black Myth, Wukong, Stellar Blade, Wu Chang Fallen Feathers, and so many more. Happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. As stated a moment ago, Marvel's Wolverine has quickly found itself in the crosshairs of many online commentators for the depiction of iconic female characters in the game. Inevitably, this led many critics back to the same familiar name that seems to surface in every one of these debates: Sweet Baby Inc. The Montreal-based narrative consultancy has become infamous for its work on diversity and inclusion in high-profile titles, and while the company insists its goal is to tell better, more empathetic stories, skeptics argue that it's become a driving force behind the homogenization of female character design, a process that so often seems to strip away the femininity, glamour, and aspirational qualities that once defined these characters, which brings us to the real question at the heart of this debate, one that goes far beyond Mystique's jawline or Jean Grey's cheekbones. Why is this happening? Why, in a medium built on escapism, fantasy, and heightened imagination, are developers so determined to sand down the features that once made their heroines larger than life? And perhaps most importantly, why does it anger so many players when they do? If the uproar over Mystique and Jean Grey were isolated incidents, it might be easy to dismiss them as overreactions, a vocal minority online doing what they do best. But that argument collapses under even the lightest scrutiny, because what's happening in Wolverine is only the latest chapter in a much larger and far more consistent trend. Across the biggest franchises in Western gaming, female characters are being remodelled, not simply redesigned, but fundamentally altered in ways that have become so predictable that players can now spot them from just a single screenshot. Take Star Wars Outlaws as an example. On paper, Kay Vess is the ideal protagonist for a new single-player Star Wars adventure, a morally ambiguous thief trying to survive in the galaxy's criminal underbelly, but the conversation surrounding her character design quickly became more about her face than her backstory. Fans were quick to compare the in-game model with actress Humberly Gonzalez, whose likeness was used as the basis for the character, and the difference was hard to ignore. The digital K has noticeably harsher features, a more pronounced chin, and what many felt was a deliberate attempt to strip away femininity. When asked about the backlash, creative director Julian Geraghty brushed it off as bad faith criticism, and instead K was beautiful, a response that only fueled the perception that legitimate consumer feedback was being dismissed out of hand. Then there's, of course, Horizon. When Forbidden West launched, longtime fans of Aloy were stunned by how drastically her appearance had changed from the first game. Gone was the youthful, lightly idealised adventurer from Zero Dawn, and her place was a noticeably rounder-faced, plainer character that many players felt had been deliberately altered. That accusation was later echoed by a whistleblower inside Guerrilla Games, who claimed that members of the cinematic team had confirmed Aloy was, in their own words, deliberately made less pretty for the sequel. It's difficult to interpret that as anything other than a conscious aesthetic choice, one that was intended to send a message rather than simply serve the story. On the subject of this trend, the shift is perhaps most obvious in franchises with a long-established visual style. Take Mortal Kombat. In the space of a single console generation, its female cast transformed from the hyper-stylized, overtly sexualized designs of Mortal Kombat 9 to the heavily covered, deliberately grounded models of Mortal Kombat 11. Ed Boon himself admitted in an interview that, with hindsight, he would have toned those designs back even further, a statement that encapsulates the prevailing sentiment in many Western studios, the idea that the old approach wasn't just dated, but wrong. The reimagining of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles' April O'Neil is another example that's proven impossible for fans to ignore. Once depicted as a stylish, athletic reporter, the modern April has been redesigned as a heavier, frumpier and, as one critic put it, a lunch lady on purpose. Supporters called this more relatable and grounded, but critics argue that relatability shouldn't mean draining a character of all visual appeal. And honestly, who could blame them? Of course, even brand new IPs aren't immune. Games like Concord and Dustborn, both hyped as flagship next-gen experiences, have faced overwhelming criticism for character designs that fans describe as ugly, generic, and soulless. In each case, the reaction is the same. Players express disappointment, developers double down, and the debate moves on until the next example arrives. And then there's Dragon Age the Veilguard, a franchise that's once prided itself on memorable character design, threw its entire previous art direction out of the window. In fact, even a former BioWare writer admitted that the new art style left him cold, and that he probably wouldn't buy the game based on its aesthetics alone. Steam reviews and Reddit threads echoed that sentiment, describing the cast as some of the ugliest character designs the industry has seen. When you line these examples up next to one another, the conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. This isn't a handful of isolated artistic decisions. It's not a coincidence. It's a pattern, a consistent industry-wide shift towards a new visual ideology, one where beauty, glamour and aspiration are treated as outdated relics of a less progressive era, and where female characters are systematically redesigned to conform to a narrower, more politically palatable vision of what women should look like. Men. And worst of all, they call that realism, as if realism was ever the point. By this point, it's fairly obvious that what we're seeing isn't just a series of random art decisions gone wrong. When the same trend keeps emerging across multiple franchises from multiple studios over multiple years, it's no longer an accident, it's a design philosophy, and crucially, it's a philosophy being driven by factors that have far less to do with storytelling or art direction than the industry would like to admit. So, with that said, let's attempt to unravel what is driving this bizarre direction. The first and perhaps most visible of factors that often gets blamed is the rise of the consultancy class, companies like Sweet Baby Inc. Founded in 2018, the Montreal-based narrative development firm, whose stated mission is to make games more engaging, more meaningful and more inclusive for everyone. On the surface that sounds innocuous enough, but dig a little deeper and the language becomes more revealing. One of the company's narrative designers, Cameron Wild, described his goal as burning the games industry to the ground. Another explained that the point was to prove that space where whiteness doesn't have to live is where some of the best stories are told. These, of course, do not sound like the words of a neutral creative consultancy helping studios refine story structure. They are the words of activists with a worldview who see the medium as a vehicle for social engineering. And worst of all, their influence is far from trivial. Sweet Baby has been credited on major titles like Spider-Man 2 and Alan Wake 2, and the company itself confirmed it was involved in the early development of Wolverine. That involvement may continue today, though Sony and Insomniac have declined to clarify the extent of their current relationship, a silence that many observers interpret as deliberate damage control. Even if their contract has ended, decisions made during those formative months will still shape the final product, and so too will the ideology behind them. But Sweet Baby is only one piece of the puzzle. The reality is that much of this shift is happening within the studios themselves. Del Walker, a veteran artist who has worked at Naughty Dog, Rocksteady and Respawn, offered one of the most revealing glimpses into the modern development process. There's been a handful of times I've pitched black women characters that look beautiful, he explained. Then, after 10 iterations, the concept or model comes back without a speck of the original beauty I pitched. They go from beautiful to grocery store aunties. This isn't about bad luck or individual creative choices, it's institutional. Artists are repeatedly told that conventionally attractive characters are unacceptable, and the final designs reflect that systemic pressure, which, while sounding so ridiculous that it sounds actually satirical, is exactly why it's so insidious. It's not a joke. It's policy, a creeping creative orthodoxy that punishes beauty on principle and rewrites the very idea of what a heroine is allowed to be. Things were never like this in the past. Just look back at X-Men vs Street Fighter, one of the finest games ever released on the Sega Saturn. Characters like Rogue and Chun-Li were powerful, stylish and unapologetically feminine, proving that strength and beauty could coexist without compromise. This was the same era that gave us Tomb Raider and the original Lara Croft, an icon who didn't need to be stripped of her femininity to be taken seriously. If the soulless sludge of modern AAA gaming has left you bored to tears, and do yourself a favour and check out my brand new channel Lady Arcade, where I've just released a deep dive into the Sega Saturn, a proper dose of gaming magic from a time when creativity, charm and beauty actually mattered. Link in the description and the pinned comment. As for why the so-called uglification is being pushed throughout the industry, part of it stems from a conscious rejection of what academics and critics call the male gaze, the idea that women in media have historically been portrayed primarily as objects of male desire. In the 1990s and early 2000s, this often manifested as hypersexualized character designs, impossibly proportioned warriors in bikini armor, doe-eyed damsels with physics-defying anatomy, and so on. Modern developers, many of them steeped in gender theory and media studies, now view those designs as inherently problematic. As one game developer article put it, by hypersexualizing female characters, designers cater to male desire and encourage players to view women as objects rather than complex, multifaceted characters. The pushback against that thinking has been so intense that even moderate expressions of femininity are often treated as suspicious, and character designs are altered to avoid being accused of objectification. That ideological mission has dovetailed neatly with a second political imperative, the drive to depict women as equal to men, not just in terms of narrative agency, but in terms of physicality, temperament, and visual presentation. It's a philosophy summed up by one industry analyst as beating men at their own strengths. The result? Female characters with square jaws, broader shoulders, bulkier frames, and deliberately stoic personalities designed not to complement their male counterparts but to outmatch them on their own terms. What's really insulting about all of this is the underlying message that in order to improve female characters, you need to strip away everything about them that is feminine and mold them into something that is much more akin to men. Like, seriously, what the The irony, of course, is that by erasing traditionally feminine qualities in the pursuit of equality, developers end up reinforcing the notion that masculine traits are inherently more valuable. Then there's what many critics see as the most misguided motivation of all: overcorrection. For years, the argument that female characters were too sexualized wasn't about merit. Gaming, like most media, often reduced its heroines to pin-ups rather than people, but rather than simply introducing a wider range of body types, personalities and aesthetics, many studios have overcorrected so aggressively that they've swung to the opposite extreme. Where once developers were criticised for portraying women as idealised fantasies, they're now criticised for portraying them as deliberately unappealing caricatures. As one Reddit user has put it, they've replaced female curves with cellulite and vitiligo, swapped aspirational heroes for deliberately unattractive everywomen, and call it progress. This isn't creativity, it's ideology, pure and simple. It's designed by manifesto, and the evidence is everywhere, from Sweet Baby's stated desire to burn the industry down to artists' accounts of being pressured into uglifying their characters to the academic dogma that has redefined what's considered acceptable femininity. The pattern is unmistakable. The end product isn't the result of a studio's artistic vision or a character's narrative needs. It's the product of a worldview that sees beauty as a political problem to be solved, femininity as a patriarchal construct to be deconstructed, and player expectations as obstacles to be overcome rather than audiences to be served. And that's why when you look at the landscape of modern Western releases, the changes all point in the same direction. Of course, this isn't the case of thousands of developers independently deciding that women should look like tired middle managers instead of larger-than-life heroines. It's that the industry itself, from external consultants to internal art departments, has decided that's what women must look like whether players like it or not. Whenever this topic surfaces, there's always a predictable chorus from certain corners of the internet insisting that anyone criticising these design trends is just being sexist. It's a lazy catch-all dismissal that lets developers and journalists ignore the underlying issues and paint legitimate criticism as bigotry. But to reduce the backlash to misogyny is to miss the point entirely. What we're witnessing isn't simply a reaction to how a character looks, it's a deeper frustration with how gaming itself is changing and what those changes say about the priorities of the people making these games. The first and perhaps most fundamental reason players are angry is that they feel something essential to gaming is being stripped away. Escapism. Games have always offered a space to step outside the constraints of reality to become something stronger, more heroic, more beautiful, or perhaps more powerful than we are in everyday life. For decades, video games have been the ultimate embodiment of that philosophy. Heroes and heroines were idealised because the worlds they inhabited were idealised, and that idealism mattered. It was aspirational, even comforting. When you picked up a controller, you weren't looking for a mirror, you were looking for a doorway into somewhere bigger, bolder, and more exciting than reality, but increasingly developers seem determined to slam that door shut. Instead of aspirational characters, players are given relatable ones, which often means characters that look, act and speak just like the people we see every day. In other words, the very thing games were once designed to free us from is now being deliberately put back in. So, bearing this in mind, it's hardly a surprise that players see this as a betrayal of what the medium was supposed to be. The second driver of this anger is the sense that politics is being imposed on their entertainment. Gaming audiences are not oblivious to social change. They're perfectly capable of accepting diverse characters and progressive ideas when they emerge naturally from a story. The frustration comes when those ideas are forced into the product with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. As one Gamescom analysis put it, political grandstanding might earn applause from journalists desperate to turn gaming into an extension of their activism, but it doesn't sell copies. And gamers know it. They can see when a design decision is about narrative necessity and when it's about ideology. They can tell when a studio is trying to create an engaging character and when it's trying to make a statement. And when it's the latter, they tend to recoil not because they're threatened by the politics, but because they feel like they're being lectured instead of entertained. This sense of alienation becomes even more pronounced when you compare how Western and Eastern studios approach character design. The East-West divide on this issue is now so stark, it's practically a case study in cultural difference. Eastern developers like Shift Up and Square Enix have continued to create characters who are aspirational, beautiful and larger than life, and they've been rewarded handsomely for it. Stellar Blade, a Korean action RPG, drew sneers from Western games media for its unapologetically feminine protagonist Eve, yet it smashed sales expectations, shifted millions of copies, and topped charts worldwide. Likewise, Final Fantasy continues to produce female characters who are complex and well written and visually striking. Proof that attractiveness and depth are not mutually exclusive. Meanwhile, Western studios seem to be doing the opposite, stripping out glamour and aspirational qualities, even as their games underperform. Concord, the heavily marketed hero shooter criticised for its ugly character designs, shut down a mere 2 weeks after launch, as we all know. Dragon Age: The Veilguard was lambasted for its art style and suffered poor user scores. Star Wars Outlaws under-delivered despite the power of the licence. When you compare those results to the success of games that lean into aesthetic appeal, the conclusion is difficult to ignore. The market is speaking, and it's not impressed. The cultural clash isn't just about aesthetics though, it's also about how studios respond to criticism. In the East, the mantra tends to be, the customer is always right. When Paramount released the first Sonic the Hedgehog trailer, fans recoiled at ugly Sonic. The studio listened, it delayed the film, redesigned the character, and ended up with a blockbuster hit. When Capcom's Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite drew criticism for Chun-Li's off-model face, the developers acknowledged the complaints and improved the design before release. In the West, however, the attitude is often, we know better. When fans criticised Kay Vess's appearance, Ubisoft's Julian Gorighty dismissed the concerns as bad faith. Guerrilla Games ignored widespread complaints about Aloy's altered design. BioWare shrugged off criticism of Veilguard's aesthetics entirely. This refusal to engage with feedback only deepens the resentment because it suggests that the audience, the people actually paying for these games, no longer matters. And perhaps that's the final source of anger here. Consumer reality. Players are tired of being told that what they want is wrong. They're tired of being labelled toxic or bigoted for preferring characters who are beautiful, heroic or aspirational. They're tired of watching games that sabotage themselves to satisfy ideological checklists, and they're especially tired of being blamed when those games flop, as if the audience's refusal to buy something they didn't want is the real problem. This is why the debate over character design has become so heated. It's not about superficial preferences or juvenile complaints over which character is hot. It's about a fundamental disagreement over what video games are supposed to be. Are they works of entertainment crafted to capture our imagination, transport us to extraordinary worlds and let us inhabit extraordinary people? Or are they political tools designed to reflect ideological priorities and reshape cultural attitudes? For most players, the answer is obvious. They want a game to escape from the world, not to be reminded of it. And when they see that ideal is being stripped away, not because the story demands it, but because a committee somewhere decided it was the right thing to do, they don't just feel disappointed, they feel betrayed. To be clear, not everyone sees this shift as negative, with some merely viewing the changes as artistic evolution, a natural maturing of a medium that's still relatively young. Developers and academics who support these changes argue that the rejection of the so-called male gaze allows for more complex, more meaningful character writing, whether we have seen many good examples of this or not. This leads to the next counterpoint: industry maturation. The audience for video games is not what it was 30 years ago. Back in the 1990s, the stereotype of the teenage male gamer was fairly accurate, and games were built around that assumption. But today, the demographic landscape is radically different. The global player base is said to now be almost evenly split between men and women, and the average gamer is in their mid-30s. In that context, advocates argue clinging to design philosophies from the 1990s isn't just creatively limiting, it's commercially short-sighted. If half the audience doesn't see themselves reflected in a game, then half of the potential market is being ignored. Then, finally, there is the economic case. Proponents point out that diversity isn't just a moral argument, it's also a business strategy. A wider range of character designs, stories and perspectives can open the door to new audiences and new revenue streams. Major publishers are quick to highlight the success of games with diverse casts and non-traditional protagonists as evidence that inclusion can expand the market rather than shrink it. As one industry analysis put it, game developers can attract a wider audience and tap into new markets by showcasing various characters and narratives. It opens opportunities for fresh and innovative storytelling, pushing the boundaries of what games can offer. All of these arguments sound persuasive, and to a certain extent they're not wrong. Character depth is important, the player base has evolved, but there's a glaring flaw running through all of these justifications, and it's this: they almost always treat ideals as if they were evidence. Yes, in theory, more diverse designs should make more people feel seen, but there's little sign that this has translated into increased engagement or sales. If anything, the opposite is true. Many of the games most loudly praised for their realistic or inclusive character designs, Concord, Dustborn, Dragon Age of the Veilguard, have struggled commercially or failed outright. Meanwhile, titles that embrace aspirational design, Stellar Blade, Nikki and Wu Chang Fallen Feathers have smashed sales expectations despite relentless criticism from certain media outlets. So sure, moving beyond the so-called male gaze in theory could create more nuanced characters, but it doesn't automatically make them better written or more appealing. A character can be complex and deeply human while still being very attractive. The notion that those two qualities are mutually exclusive is a false dichotomy that serves ideology and not storytelling. And that's what makes the uglification of gaming so ridiculous. At its core, much of the defense of uglification is built on noble intentions, but noble intentions don't guarantee good results, and the results, at least so far, have been mixed at best. The uncomfortable truth is that many of these ideological ideals are not market realities. They're based on what activists, academics and studio executives want to be true, rather than what players are actually responding to. And that's why the backlash continues, because until the industry can prove that these ideals align with what gamers want, not just what critics applaud, the gap between developer priorities and audience expectations will only keep widening. And sadly, the debates about the art direction of gaming are only continuing to get uglier. By now, it's obvious that the uglification argument isn't just about art direction, it's not really about cheekbones, jawlines or costume design, it's about ideology. What began as a conversation about aesthetics has been swallowed whole by the culture wars, transforming character design into a political litmus test. On one side of this divide is the progressive view, which sees the rejection of traditional beauty standards as a moral imperative. From this perspective, the idealised hyper-feminine character designs that dominated gaming in the past weren't harmless fantasy, they were symptoms of a deeper problem. They perpetuated what they saw as unrealistic body standards, reduced women to objects of male desire, and excluded anyone who didn't fit a narrow mould of what femininity was supposed to look like. In this worldview, making female characters plainer, more diverse, or even deliberately unattractive isn't a bug, it's a feature. For progressives, this isn't uglification at all, but liberation from outdated standards. It's a creative and political statement rolled into one. But of course, many others are not buying any of that. The conservative view, on the other hand, sees the exact same phenomenon as something far more sinister: ideological capture. To this side of the argument, the deliberate move away from beauty and glamour isn't an act of progress, but a rejection of what made gaming special in the first place. It represents the intrusion of activism into entertainment, a deliberate attempt to reshape cultural norms by force. Conservatives argue that this isn't just about aesthetics, it's about the erosion of escapism itself. By replacing escapes with lectures about representation and social justice, developers are robbing players of that escape and replacing it with a moral instruction that they never asked for. And that, they say, is why the backlash is so intense, because it's not a disagreement over style, but over purpose. Of course, though, this ideological tug-of-war isn't new. In many ways, it's a direct continuation of the battle lines drawn during Gamergate. Back in 2014, what began as a debate over ethics in games journalism quickly metastasized into a broader cultural conflict over identity, feminism, and political correctness in gaming. On one side were activists, journalists, and developers pushing for greater diversity and representation. On the other were gamers who felt their hobby was being co-opted and politicised. The fallout from that conflict didn't just change how the industry operated, it fundamentally altered how gaming was discussed, and is a legacy that lingers today, shaping the language, assumptions, and fault lines of every new controversy. The result is a discourse that's become aggressively tribal. The vocabulary of the debate, once about art direction and character design, is now the language of political warfare. Critics of the new design philosophy are routinely dismissed as chuds, incels, or man-babies, labels meant to delegitimise their opinions before they can even be heard. Meanwhile, defenders of inclusive design are derided as woke, NPCs, or soy devs, equally dismissive insults that reduce complex ideas to caricature. The nuance is gone. What remains is a culture war in miniature, where two sides scream past each other, certain that the other represents everything that's wrong with the medium. For all the talks of ideology and cultural shifts, the reality is that no matter how much studios want to shape the medium according to their beliefs, they still have to contend with one immovable force: the market. And over the past couple of years, the market has started to send a very clear message, one that's proving increasingly difficult for the industry to ignore. The most obvious evidence of this is the extraordinary success of Stellar Blade. At its peak, Stellar Blade boasted over 188,000 concurrent players on Steam and remained one of the platform's best-selling titles for weeks. And crucially, it didn't succeed despite its character design, it succeeded because of it. The aspirational, striking, larger-than-life heroine that so many Western studios now avoid proved that there's still huge demand for precisely the kind of character they've been trying to erase. That wasn't an isolated case. Across the industry, we're beginning to see a clear pattern. Games that lean into traditional design philosophies and deliver on what audiences actually want are thriving, while those that ignore player preferences are struggling or outright failing. The message from consumers is unmistakable. They're voting with their wallets, and the games that align with their tastes are being rewarded, whereas those that double down on ideology are being punished. This commercial reality is starting to have knock-on effects within the industry itself, fueling a growing sense of developer discontent. We're hearing more and more stories from inside major studios of artists and designers becoming frustrated with top-down mandates that force them to tone down or alter their choices. Del Walker's now famous grocery store auntie's remark, which I mentioned earlier, describing how beautiful character designs are repeatedly revised into mediocrity, is far from an isolated complaint. Several industry veterans have spoken out, albeit often anonymously, about the demoralising experience of watching their work sanitised in the name of politics rather than creative vision. That frustration matters because talent is the lifeblood of the industry, and enough of that talent becomes disillusioned, studios will eventually be forced to adapt. At the same time, consumer awareness of ideological influence in games is rising rapidly, and a lot of gamers are no longer willing to blindly trust that studios have their best interests at heart. And that's the real pressure point here. Studios might be able to ignore angry tweets or bad faith accusations online, they can shrug off critical YouTube videos and think pieces, but they cannot ignore sales data, they cannot ignore failing live service models, disappointing revenue forecasts, and franchises underperforming despite billion-dollar budgets. They cannot ignore a global market where games like Stellar Blade and Black Myth Wukong, titles that embrace the very design philosophies Western developers are abandoning, routinely outperform their heavily politicised competitors. For all the talk of progress and representation, video games remain a business, and businesses ultimately respond to incentives. Right now, the incentive is clear. The more studios push back against the natural desires of their audience, the less money they make. The more they embrace those desires for fantasy, for aspiration, for striking and memorable characters, the more successful they become. It's not ideology that will decide the future direction of game design, it's economics. And that may be the most helpful sign of all. For years, the conversation around character design has felt like a one-way lecture, a small group of developers, journalists and consultants telling players what they should want. But now, the players are actively voting with their wallets. For most of gaming's history, games were places to dream. They weren't meant to mirror the real world. They were meant to let us escape from it, but somewhere along the way, that purpose became contested. A growing faction within the industry decided that games shouldn't just entertain, they should educate, influence and reprogram. They shouldn't just reflect our fantasies, they should reflect our politics. And so, slowly but surely, the focus shifted. Games stopped asking what would be most fun and started asking what would be most virtuous. The truth is that most players don't pick up a controller to be preached to. They don't want to be told what they should value or which ideals they should embrace. They want to be swept away to worlds that feel magical, not mundane. And when that fundamental purpose is forgotten, the very soul of the medium becomes a risk. That's why the backlash over Mystique's redesign matters. That's why people care about Aloy's face or Eve's character model. It's not superficial vanity, it's a reaction to something deeper. It's a signal from the audience that they know what gaming once was, and they're not ready to let it be turned into something else. Speaking of when gaming was still about joy and imagination rather than corporate box ticking, that's exactly why I've launched a brand new YouTube channel, Lady Arcade, dedicated entirely to celebrating the magic of gaming's past, just like I used to. With so many players falling out of love with the modern industry, there's never been a better time to rediscover gems like the Sega Saturn era. And if you do still enjoy dipping into the best of today's titles, I can help with that too. My discount links below give you huge savings on games like Stellar Blade, Expedition 33 and thousands more, and every purchase saves you money and supports this channel simultaneously. And for those who truly love what I do, you can get access to my behind the scenes cosplay library and much more over on Patreon. I'll see you all again soon.